Throughout recorded history, the deaths of individual figures at precise moments have altered the trajectories of entire civilizations in ways that no one involved could have anticipated or intended. Philip II of Macedon spent his career achieving things that contemporaries considered beyond reach, transforming a kingdom long dismissed by neighboring powers into the dominant force in the PCS Greek world through a combination of military innovation, disciplined statecraft, and relentless ambition. He restructured his army around a revolutionary pike-based formation, led that army to a decisive victory over the combined forces of Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, and subsequently unified the fractious Greek city-states under Macedonian authority. He had also personally conceived and begun preparing a large-scale invasion of the Persian Empire, the wealthiest and most powerful state in the known world. By any reasonable measure, he was the most consequential military and political figure of his era. He was killed at his own daughter's wedding in 336 BC, stabbed in a theater by one of his own bodyguards, a man named Pausanias, who, according to ancient sources, was motivated by a personal grievance that Philip had declined to address. Whether Pausanias acted entirely on his own initiative, or whether others, including Philip's formidable former wife Olympias or his 20-year-old son Alexander, had prior knowledge of the plot has remained a source of historical debate for more than 2 millennia. What admits no serious dispute as the consequence, Alexander inherited not only the throne and the army, but also the invasion plan, and then executed it on a scale that exceeded anything Philip had designed. Within 13 years, Alexander had dismantled the Persian Empire. It absorbed Egypt and the Levant, pushed through Mesopotamia and Central Asia, and reached the northwestern frontier of India. The Hellenistic age that followed, defined by the spread of Greek language, philosophy, and culture across the Near East and its fusion with indigenous traditions, was the direct product of a plan conceived by one man and realized by another who turned out to be something history had not quite seen before. The bodyguard who killed Philip did not derail the Persian campaign. He inadvertently transferred it to the one person capable of making it legendary. The men who assassinated Julius Caesar were, by their own account, acting to preserve something precious. They called themselves the Liberators, and their self-description was not entirely dishonest. They genuinely believed that Caesar's accumulation of power represented an existential threat to the Roman Republic, and that removing him would allow its institutions to recover and function as they had been designed to function. The conspiracy was broad, carefully organized, and executed in public on the 15th of March, 44 BC, in the theater of Pompey, where Caesar was surrounded by senators who produced concealed daggers and stabbed him 23 times. He fell at the base of a statue of his former rival Pompey, a detail that no dramatist would have dared invent. The conspirators walked out expecting the Republic to reassert itself. What followed instead was nearly 2 decades of civil war. Caesar's adopted heir Octavian, his lieutenant Mark Antony, and the general Lepidus formed a coalition that hunted down the conspirators, and when that task was complete, turned on each other. The conflict resolved at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, with Octavian as the sole surviving power. And in 27 BC, the Senate granted him the title Augustus, making him Rome's first emperor. The republic the liberators had killed to protect was gone, replaced by the very form of consolidated personal rule they had tried to prevent. Except now it was formalized, institutionalized, and durable in ways Caesar's informal dominance had never been. The Roman Empire that emerged from that transformation would govern Europe, North Africa, and the Near East for 5 centuries and leave legal, linguistic, and administrative imprints that shaped Western civilization long after its collapse. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on the 28th of June, 1914 in Sarajevo remains the event that historians return to repeatedly when trying to explain how a single killing in a provincial city detonated a war that consumed an entire generation. Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was shot by Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb nationalist connected to a secret organization known as the Black Hand. What makes the event particularly striking is how narrowly it came to succeeding at all. Earlier that same morning, another conspirator had thrown a bomb at the Archduke's motorcade, but it bounced off the vehicle, rolled beneath a following car, and detonated too late to cause the intended harm. Franz Ferdinand, apparently not a man easily rattled, continued with his schedule and proceeded to visit those wounded in the earlier explosion before his driver took a wrong turn on the return route, one that happened to bring the car to a near stop directly in front of the position where Princip stood, having already concluded that the morning's opportunity had passed. Princip fired twice. What followed in the diplomatic sphere moved with a speed and a mechanical inevitability that still unsettles those who study it. Austria-Hungary issued Serbia an ultimatum crafted specifically to be unacceptable. Serbia accepted the overwhelming majority of its terms. Austria-Hungary declared war regardless. Russia mobilized in response. Germany declared war on Russia, and then France, and then invaded Belgium, which brought Britain into the conflict. Within 6 weeks of that second shot on a Bosnian street, the whole of Europe was at war. The accounting that followed included an estimated 20 million dead, the collapse of 4 empires, the Russian Revolution, and the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which were sufficiently punishing and sufficiently humiliating to function, as historians have long observed, as a 20-year preparation for the Second World War. The chain of consequence that runs from a wrong turn in a motorcade to the mid-20th century's catastrophes is not a historical curiosity. It is one of the clearest illustrations available of how contingent and how fragile the structures of the modern world actually are. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on the 14th of April, 1865, at Ford's Theater in Washington, shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth, an actor and committed Confederate sympathizer who had spent weeks planning what turned out to be a coordinated assault on multiple members of the administration. Vice President Andrew Johnson was also targeted that night, and Secretary of State William Seward was stabbed in his home by another conspirator and survived only narrowly. Only Booth's attack achieved its intended result. Lincoln died the following morning. The timing carried a particular weight because the assassination came 5 days after the effective end of the Civil War. 5 days after Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Lincoln had spent the final weeks of his life articulating a vision for what national reconciliation should look like. Had described in his second inaugural address a desire for malice toward none, and had developed both a political philosophy and a practical strategy for the reconstruction of the South and the integration of 4 million newly freed people into American civic life. What he had not done was find a successor capable of carrying any of that forward. Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat with no meaningful sympathy for the people the war had just freed, inherited the presidency and proceeded to systematically dismantle the ambitions of the Reconstruction program. He vetoed civil rights legislation, extended leniency to former Confederate leaders, and engaged in a sustained conflict with Congress that eventually resulted in his impeachment. The consequence was a Reconstruction era that fell dramatically short of what Lincoln had envisioned, followed by a decades-long reversal of the political and civil rights that had briefly been extended to Black Americans. Across the South, the installation of Jim Crow as a governing architecture of enforced racial inequality and a century of legal segregation. Historians continue to debate what Lincoln might have accomplished had he lived, and they are right to keep doing so. Because the distance between what was possible in 1865, what actually materialized, is one of the most consequential counterfactual spaces in American history. Booth believed he was striking a blow on behalf of the Confederacy. In practical terms, he handed the Confederacy the outcome it could not achieve on the battlefield. The assassination of John F. Kennedy on the 22nd of November, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, struck something in the national consciousness that has not fully recovered, and the reason is only partly the loss of the president himself. Kennedy was shot during a motorcade through Dealey Plaza and pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital 30 minutes later. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested that same afternoon, and 2 days later was shot dead in a police corridor by a nightclub operator named Jack Ruby, in front of rolling television cameras. Eliminating the one person who might have provided a coherent account of events under oath, the Warren Commission concluded in 1964 that Oswald had acted alone. Separate House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded in 1979 that Kennedy was probably killed as the result of a conspiracy. Those two official findings have contradicted each other for over 60 years without resolution. Kennedy had been president for less than 3 years, a period that included the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, the closest the world has come to nuclear exchange. Resolved through negotiations, in which Kennedy privately agreed not to invade Cuba and to remove American missiles from Turkey in exchange for the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, expanded American military involvement in Vietnam from approximately 16,000 advisors to more than 500,000 combat troops by 1968. Several of Kennedy's former advisors have maintained that he was privately reconsidering that commitment before his death. Whether that is accurate and what it would have meant for the course of the war and for the tens of thousands of American and Vietnamese lives that followed has been among the most intensely argued counterfactuals in American foreign policy history. The question the Kennedy assassination leaves open is not only who was responsible, but what the remainder of the decade might have looked like under a president who was still alive to make decisions. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on the 4th of April, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. Shot once by a rifle bullet while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He had come to Memphis in support of a sanitation workers' strike, and that context mattered, because by 1968 King had moved well beyond the legal architecture of civil rights toward the economic structures that kept Black Americans in poverty, regardless of what the statute book said. He had publicly opposed the Vietnam War, position that cost him important political alliances and drew accusations of communist sympathy from powerful quarters, including from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which had spent years running a documented program of surveillance, harassment, and psychological pressure against him. He was in the planning stages of what he called the Poor People's Campaign, an intended occupation of Washington designed to demand economic rights for all poor Americans across racial lines. A coalition explicitly constructed to be too large and too diverse to dismiss. James Earl Ray was arrested in London 2 months after the shooting, pleaded guilty in 1969, and received a 99-year sentence before almost immediately claiming he had been manipulated into the plea. In 1999, a civil jury in Memphis found that government agencies had been involved in a conspiracy to bring about King's death. The Department of Justice investigated and rejected that conclusion. What ended on that motel balcony, definitively, was the Poor People's Campaign and the economic phase of a movement that had already transformed the legal foundations of American life and was preparing to go further. Robert Kennedy was assassinated on the 5th of June, 1968. In the kitchen corridor of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, moments after claiming victory in the California Democratic presidential primary. He died the following day. His death, occurring in a year that had already witnessed King's assassination and was being consumed by the Vietnam War and widespread civil unrest, produced a specific quality of national despair that has adhered to the year 1968 ever since. Sirhan was arrested immediately and convicted in 1969, and has remained in prison since, with multiple parole board recommendations for release overturned by successive California governors. The forensic record in the case has never been fully reconciled. The coroner who examined Kennedy determined that the fatal shot was fired from between 1 and 3 inches behind his right ear, while witness accounts consistently placed Sirhan several feet in front of Kennedy throughout the shooting. Kennedy's removal from the race reshaped the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, which became a nationally televised confrontation between riot police and anti-war demonstrators. That imagery handed the Republican Party a land-order political narrative that Richard Nixon deployed to win the presidency. Nixon then continued and expanded American involvement in Vietnam for 4 more years. The distance between what might have occurred under a Kennedy administration and what actually happened in Southeast Asia in those years contains, among other things, the names of more than 20,000 additional Americans killed in combat. Yitzhak Rabin arrived at the peace process with credentials that made it difficult for even the most skeptical Israelis to dismiss him. He had commanded forces in the War of Independence, served as Chief of Staff during the Six-Day War of 1967, and had spent decades as a central figure in Israeli military and political life. He was not a diplomat who had never encountered the reality of armed conflict. He was the most decorated military figure in his country's history, which was precisely what gave him the authority to stand before his public and argue that negotiation offered more durable security than permanent confrontation. The Oslo Accords, which he signed on the White House lawn in September 1993 with PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat and Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, established the Palestinian Authority, created formal mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO, and built a framework intended to lead toward a final status. Agreement on the most contested questions between the two parties. He shared the Nobel Peace Prize with Arafat and Peres in 1994. On the 4th of November, 1995, he was shot twice at close range by Yigal Amir, a 25-year-old Israeli law student, at the end of a peace rally in Tel Aviv attended by more than 100,000 people. Amir stated that he had acted to halt the peace process, which he believed both endangered Israeli security and violated the requirements of Jewish religious law. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The logic behind the assassination was, from Amir's own stated perspective, coherent. Remove the one Israeli leader who possessed the military credibility to bring a skeptical public along on a territorial agreement, and the agreement loses its essential foundation. That logic proved accurate. Shimon Peres lost the 1996 election to Benjamin Netanyahu, who had campaigned against the Oslo framework. The process Rabin had constructed has not been revived in the form he intended, and the particular combination of military authority, public trust, and political will that made him capable of attempting what he attempted has not reappeared in Israeli leadership in the 3 decades since his death. Taken together, what these events suggest is not that individuals are always decisive, but that certain individuals, at certain moments, occupy positions where their presence or absence reshapes everything downstream. The killers in each of these cases believed they were resolving something, closing a chapter, eliminating a threat, or restoring an order they felt was slipping away. In most cases, they produced the opposite of their intentions, or they cleared the path for consequences far larger than any they had foreseen. And the gap between what they believed they were doing and what they actually set in motion is where much of modern history was made.